In 1964, Robert and Elaine Halloway vanished from their farm. Breakfast left half-eaten on the table. Their dog found starved beneath the porch. No note, no goodbye. Just silence, stretching across the fields. For decades, neighbors whispered about what happened that summer. Some say it was debt, others say it was murder, and a few believe the fields themselves swallowed them whole. But buried beneath the silence are clues that were never meant to be found. And once you hear them, you'll never look at an empty field the same way again, if you're drawn to unsolved disappearances. Hit subscribe. The farmhouse looked smaller than it had in the newspaper photographs. Weather does that to wood and paint. Pares it down, softens it until it seems less like a structure and more like a skeleton left out in the weather. By the time the first film crew rolled up the dirt drive in 1996, 32 years after Robert and Elaine Halloway had been declared missing, the place had already begun to collapse under its own weight. It was late summer, a dry summer, the kind where the ground cracked in plates and weeds clung stubbornly to the edges of the drive. Dust kicked up around the car tires and hung in the sunlight, thick enough to sting the back of the throat. The crew didn't say much at first. They stepped out of the van slowly, their sneakers crunching on gravel, their camera equipment shifting against shoulders. They had read the files, skimmed the old reports, seen the faded photographs. But the air around the farm made all of that seem theoretical, like the difference between reading about drowning and stepping into water for the first time. The farmhouse windows were black with grime. The porch sagged in the middle. A loose length of rope still hung from the rusted hook near the barn, swaying faintly in the wind as if it had just been untied. Nobody wanted to say it, but the air felt wrong. The Halloway case had been considered cold for decades, closed even, the kind of file that sat in the back cabinets of small-town police stations until mold began to soften the ink. The sheriff's office in 1964 had written it off as a voluntary disappearance. A couple tired of farm life, debts piling, maybe skipping town for a fresh start somewhere out west. But if that were true, why had they left everything behind? The bank books, the truck, even the family dog, still chained up when the neighbors finally came looking after a week of silence. That was the detail people still whispered about. The dog. Elaine was known to dote on it like a child, brushing its fur each evening on the porch, humming as she worked. She would never have left it behind. Never. And yet, the bowl was dry. The animal's body was found curled beneath the porch, ribs showing through its hide, jaw locked in an empty snarl. The crew set up their cameras with mechanical precision, but their eyes kept flicking back to that sagging porch, to the shadows beneath it. One of them, the youngest, said softly, "Do you think they're still here?" The producer ignored him, adjusted her headset, told the cameraman to pan slowly across the cornfield that stretched behind the house. The field was empty now, only brittle stalks long past harvest. But it wasn't hard to imagine the summer of '64. Tall green corn, rows neat and endless, an ocean to swallow voices. That summer, the neighbors had sworn they heard something. A scream, a low rumble, the sound of an engine late at night. No one had called the sheriff at the time. People minded their own business. By the time the silence stretched too long, by the time someone finally drove over to check, the farm was already different. The breakfast dishes were still on the table, eggs half eaten, coffee cups half full, as though Robert and Elaine had been interrupted mid-sentence. The bed was unmade, the back door was unlocked, and the fields looked as though something heavy had been dragged through them, deep furrows cutting between the rows. But there were no footprints, no tire tracks, just soil churned and disturbed as though by invisible hands. The crew filmed until dusk, their voices low, their eyes darting toward the barn whenever the wind creaked its beams. Later, back at the motel, one of them replayed the footage. At 27 minutes, 13 seconds in, just as the camera pans across the second-story window, there's a flicker, a shadow. No one had been in the house. No one living, anyway. The first time Detective Samuel Porter heard the name Halloway. He was a rookie, 23, barely old enough to keep his badge from sliding loose in his hand, his head still full of academy lectures about procedure and paperwork. The case had already been cold for more than 2 decades by then. He remembered a sergeant, an old man with a smoker's cough, tossing the thick, gray-stained file onto a table like a deck of ruined cards. "Read this," the sergeant had grunted, "if you want to know what a dead end looks like." Porter had read every page that night in his apartment, his lamp buzzing faintly, moths slapping against the screen. He had read about Robert and Elaine, their quiet farm life, the unpaid bills that hinted at trouble. He had read about the neighbors, the Coopers to the west, the Daniels to the south, each insisting they had no clue where the Halloways could have gone. But what had stayed with him most wasn't in the official reports. It was in the photographs. The kitchen table set for breakfast, the dishes still greasy with yolk. Elaine's glasses folded neatly on the counter. A Bible, open to Psalms, on the nightstand beside the bed. Porter had stared at those photographs until the images pressed themselves behind his eyelids. That absence, louder than any evidence, was what haunted him. Now, nearly 40 years after the disappearance, Porter was no longer the rookie with moths on his screen. He was 61, retired from the force, widowed, with more nights behind him than ahead. Yet the name Halloway still scratched at the back of his mind. He had spent a career chasing men who left blood on walls and bodies in rivers. But the Halloways had left nothing. And nothing, Porter had learned, was worse than everything. In the summer of 2003, a new documentary series began making its rounds on cable television. Vanished, America's Unsolved. It was slick, dramatic, built for ratings. Porter rolled his eyes when he saw the promo, the host framed in silhouette against a glowing barn door. But when he heard the words Halloway Farm, he set down his glass and leaned forward. The episode rekindled public fascination with the case. Local reporters dug up their own features. Old neighbors gave hesitant interviews. And for the first time in decades, tips trickled into the sheriff's office again. Most were useless. A psychic claimed the couple had been buried under the barn. A drifter swore he had seen them hitchhiking on a highway in Texas. Another man insisted aliens had taken them, pointing to scorched patches in the cornfield as proof. Still, one tip stood out. It came from a woman named Mary Collins, who had been only 12 years old in 1964. She told reporters she remembered her father waking suddenly one night, muttering about an engine in the distance, headlights moving where no headlights should be. He had looked out across their pasture and said, "Something's wrong at the Halloways," but he never went to check. Collins had kept quiet for decades, but now, in her 70s, she felt compelled to speak. "I can still hear it," she told the camera crew, her hands trembling. "That engine, it wasn't a tractor, it was something heavier, and then it just stopped." Porter watched the segment 3 times in a row. He felt the itch return, the same itch he'd had as a rookie, staring at photographs of eggs cooling on plates. The silence wasn't natural. It was constructed. Someone had made the Halloways disappear. By autumn, Porter found himself driving back toward the county where he had first worn a badge. The roads were narrower than he remembered, the trees taller. Some of the farmhouses were abandoned now. Their barns collapsed, roofs sagging like broken backs. Others were modernized with satellite dishes and shiny mailboxes. But the Halloway place was still there, untouched except by weather. The white paint was nearly gone, stripped away by decades of sun and rain. The porch had collapsed on one side. The barn leaned dangerously, like an exhausted animal folding in on itself. Porter parked at the end of the drive and sat with the engine idling. The air smelled faintly of manure and dust. He thought of Elaine humming on the porch with her dog at her feet. He thought of Robert tightening the rope on the barn door. People had lived here. People had laughed here. And then one night, all of it had been snuffed out like a candle. He killed the engine. The silence pressed in. The field stretched endless and brown around him. The corn stalks had been cut down, leaving nothing but jagged stumps. The land looked barren, but Porter knew better. Land didn't forget. It only waited. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of mildew and rot. The floorboards sagged under his boots. Shards of wallpaper clung to the walls in faded patterns of roses. In the kitchen, the cabinets hung open, doors warped. Dust lay thick on the counters, except where raccoons or rats had left trails. But beneath the decay, Porter could still see the ghost of the scene from the photographs. The table in the center, the window above the sink. He could almost hear the scrape of forks, the murmur of conversation. He closed his eyes and pictured the morning of July 14th, 1964. Plates on the table, coffee steaming, the hum of cicadas outside, Elaine reaching for her glasses, Robert rising to check something in the barn. And then, interruption. Something that split their lives clean down the middle. Porter opened his eyes. The house was silent except for the wind groaning through a broken pane. He crouched low, studying the floor near the door frame. The wood was warped, darkened. Stained? Or just water damage? He touched it with his fingertips. Cold. Smooth. Too smooth. In the old reports, he remembered, there had been mention of unusual marks on the floorboards near the back door, as though something heavy had been dragged. But the photographs had been grainy, inconclusive. Now he saw them with his own eyes. Shallow grooves, two parallel lines cutting across the boards, faint but undeniable. Something had been pulled out that back door, something that didn't want to move on its own. Porter stood, his knees aching. He took a slow breath. The silence deepened. When he stepped outside again, the fields shimmered under the late sun. He followed the line of the grooves in his mind, imagining them cutting across the yard, into the corn. The stalks would have been tall that summer, tall enough to hide anything. A man, a woman, a body. His throat tightened. He told himself it was age, the chill in the air. But he knew better. The land didn't forget, and whatever had happened to Robert and Elaine Halloway, the fields had witnessed it all. Porter spent the night in a small roadside motel 10 miles south of the Halloway farm. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old smoke, the kind of odor that clung no matter how many coats of paint the walls wore. He lay on the stiff mattress, eyes fixed on the ceiling fan that ticked with each rotation, and felt the weight of silence pressing down. Sleep didn't come easy. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the grooves on the farmhouse floor. Two faint parallel scars that stretched toward the back door like unfinished sentences. He heard the echo of that 12-year-old girl's memory, the engine in the distance, the headlights cutting across a field. By dawn, he gave up on sleep entirely. He shaved at the sink, rinsed the razor in water that smelled faintly of iron, and dressed with the automatic motions of habit. Then he drove into town. The county courthouse hadn't changed much since he'd first walked its halls as a young officer. The same cracked tile floors, the same heavy wooden doors with brass handles polished smooth by decades of hands. He found the records office in the basement, where the fluorescent lights hummed and the air smelled of dust and paper. The clerk behind the counter was young, maybe 30, with a neat beard and an expression of cautious curiosity when Porter introduced himself. "Retired?" the clerk asked after glancing at the badge Porter slid across the desk. "Yeah, but still curious." The clerk tapped at his computer, then frowned. "Most of the Halloway files aren't digitized. You'll have to go through the boxes. That's what I was hoping for." He led Porter into the archives. Rows of metal shelves stretched down the room, each stacked with cardboard boxes labeled in black marker. The air grew colder between the shelves. Dust stirred at the edges of Porter's vision. The Halloway files were contained in 3 boxes, each heavier than it looked. The clerk left Porter with a nod, and Porter set to work at the long table beneath the flickering lights. The first box contained the original missing persons reports. He sifted through them slowly, recognizing the names of officers long dead. Sheriff Tom Greeley, Deputy Harlan Briggs. He could almost hear their voices as he read their words. Kitchen table set. No sign of struggle. Neighbors report no unusual activity. Dog deceased cause, starvation. Starvation. The word looked sterile on paper, but Porter pictured the body curled under the porch, the silent accusation in its empty eyes. The second box held photographs, black and white prints curling at the edges, the farmhouse frozen in its moment of abandonment, the bed unmade, Elaine's nightgown draped across the chair, Robert's boots by the door. Each image whispered of interruption, lives paused mid-motion. He turned one photograph over and saw handwriting in faded ink. Dragged? He studied the image more closely. The floorboards near the back door. Yes, faint lines, the same ones he had seen with his own eyes yesterday. Somebody had noticed, but nothing had been followed up. The third box was thinner, newspaper clippings mostly, along with notes from neighbors. Porter flipped through them slowly, scanning for inconsistencies. One article caught his attention. Local man claims to hear disturbance on night of disappearance. The date was July 20th, 6 days after the Halloways were last seen. The article quoted a farmer named Frank Dalton, who lived 2 miles east. I heard what sounded like a truck out on the road, late, maybe midnight, Dalton had told reporters. Then I heard shouting. Couldn't make out words, just shouting. Then it stopped. Porter frowned. He didn't remember seeing Dalton's name in the official reports. He shuffled through the sheriff's notes again, searching. Nothing. No interview, no follow-up. Why would a possible witness statement be left in the papers but not in the case file? He closed his eyes, leaned back in the chair, and exhaled. Cases went cold for many reasons. Lack of leads, lack of resources. But sometimes they went cold because someone wanted them to. By late afternoon, Porter carried photocopies of the most important documents back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat, flipping through the papers again, letting the timeline build itself in his head. July 14th, 1964. The Halloways eat breakfast. Sometime that day or night, they vanish. July 16th, neighbors notice the farm is silent. July 17th, sheriff investigates, finds no sign of struggle. July 20th, Dalton reports hearing shouting and a truck engine. Ignored, ignored. The word gnawed at him. He thought of the grooves on the floor, the girl's memory of headlights, the shouting carried across the fields. A picture was forming, blurred but insistent. Not a voluntary disappearance. Not a couple running from debt. Something violent had happened. Something that had been silenced. Porter checked into the diner across the street from the courthouse. It was late. The booths mostly empty. The neon sign buzzing in the window. The waitress poured him coffee without asking, her hands practiced. "Passing through?" she asked. Something like that. Her eyes flicked to the papers spread across his booth. "Old case?" "You could say that." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "You mean the Halloways?" Porter raised his eyebrows. "You know the story. Everyone here does. My grandma used to say the land swallowed them. Said you shouldn't walk too close to that farm at night. Superstition?" She shrugged. "Maybe. But kids who dared each other to go up there, they said they heard things. Voices. Like the Halloways were still calling for help." Porter studied her face. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't joking. He sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. He had spent his life balancing evidence against myth, facts against folklore. But here, in this town, The line was thinner. Maybe too thin. Back at the motel, Porter spread the copies across the bedspread. He drew lines with a pen, connecting names, dates, places. Dalton, Collins, Sheriff Greeley. His eyes landed again on Dalton's statement. The shouting, the truck. He imagined the headlights cutting across the fields, the sound of voices carried in the wind. Something being dragged from the house, across the yard, into the corn. Then silence. Always silence. Porter turned off the lamp. The room fell dark, except for the faint glow of the neon sign outside. The hum of the highway murmured in the distance. He lay still, staring into the dark, knowing he wouldn't sleep. Not yet. Not until he understood what the fields had witnessed. The name Frank Dalton kept circling in Porter's head. The forgotten witness, his words buried in the yellowed pages of a newspaper but absent from the sheriff's official report. Porter had been on the job long enough to know that omissions weren't always accidents. Sometimes, silence was chosen. He spent the next morning at the county library, a squat brick building with tall windows and the faint smell of polished wood. The librarian, an older woman with her gray hair wound into a bun, recognized the name immediately. "Dalton?" she repeated. "He's still around. Lives out by Mill Creek. Small house, trailer, really. Keeps to himself, still alive?" Porter asked, surprised. "Oh, yes, though some folks say his mind's not what it used to be." That didn't deter Porter. If anything, it made the visit more urgent. Memories might be clouded with age, but sometimes the details that survived, the stubborn fragments, were the ones that mattered most. By noon, Porter was steering his car down a cracked rural road, weeds growing tall on either side. He spotted the trailer from a distance, aluminum siding dulled by decades of weather, a pickup truck rusting beside it, and a wind chime of bent spoons clinking faintly in the breeze. Dalton was on the porch, sitting in a faded lawn chair with a blanket across his knees. His hair was white, his face creased with years, but his eyes were sharp when they fixed on Porter. "You're not from around here," Dalton said before Porter even introduced himself. "No, but I'm looking into something that happened a long time ago." Dalton gave a dry chuckle. "A lot of things happened a long time ago." "The Halloways," Porter said softly. The laughter stopped. Dalton's eyes narrowed. "You're wasting your time." Porter took a seat on the porch steps, leaving space between them. "Maybe. But I read what you told the paper back in '64, about the shouting." The truck Dalton shifted under the blanket. His knuckles tightened on the arm of the chair. "Nobody listened then? Why should they listen now?" "Because I'm listening," Porter said. "And I'm not with the sheriff's office anymore. I don't answer to anyone." For a long moment, Dalton stared across the yard, where dry grass bent under the wind. Then he sighed, heavy, as though releasing something he'd been holding for half a century. "I heard it clear," he said. "Middle of the night. My wife shook me awake, thought she heard coyotes. But it wasn't coyotes. It was a truck, big engine, heavy, and voices. Men, not the Halloways. These were deeper." Rough Porter leaned forward slightly. "How many men?" "2, maybe 3. I couldn't make out words. Just shouting, like they were struggling with something. Then I heard the dog barking, and then—" Dalton's throat tightened. "Then the dog stopped." He closed his eyes. The wind chime clinked. "I wanted to go," Dalton whispered. "I told my wife I should go. But she said no. Said it wasn't our business. People didn't get involved back then. You understand?" Porter did. Rural life was ruled by distance. Distance between farms, distance between lives. People kept to themselves, even when silence was dangerous. "What happened after?" Porter asked. Dalton's hands trembled on the blanket. "The truck idled for a long time, maybe 20 minutes. Then it drove off. Slow at first, then faster. I lay there listening, waiting for the sound to come back. It never did. Porter felt the weight of those words, the missing puzzle piece, hidden in plain sight. If Dalton had been hurt in 1964, maybe the case would have unfolded differently. "Why wasn't your statement in the report?" Porter asked. Dalton gave a bitter laugh. "Because Sheriff Greeley told me to keep my mouth shut. Said I was drunk, imagining things. I wasn't drunk. I never drank." But he looked me in the eye and said, "Frank, you didn't hear anything. You understand? And when the sheriff says you didn't hear, well, that's the end of it." Porter felt the old anger stir in his chest. Corruption, incompetence, or worse, deliberate suppression. "Why would Greeley want you silent?" Dalton's eyes flicked toward the field behind his trailer. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Because he knew something. Or owed someone. Around here, the sheriff wasn't just the law. He was part of the fabric. If he wanted the Halloways gone from memory, then they were gone." The air grew heavy. Porter heard the distant hum of insects in the grass. Dalton's words clung to him like grit. "You ever go back?" Porter asked. Dalton's jaw clenched. "Once, weeks later. Curiosity got me. I walked the edge of their field. Stupid thing to do." "What did you see?" Dalton's gaze fixed on Porter, hard and unblinking. "A hole, freshly filled. Near the tree line. Big enough for two." The words hung in the air like a shadow. "What happened then?" Porter pressed. "I went home. I never told a soul, not even my wife. You don't understand. Things had a way of sticking to you if you talk too much. Better to stay quiet, safer." Porter felt the world tilt slightly. A hole, freshly filled, near the tree line, and no record of it anywhere. He thanked Dalton, though the old man waved him off, his eyes already retreating into distance. As Porter walked back to his car, the wind carried the faint metallic clink of the spoons. Each note felt like a warning. Back at the motel, Porter sat on the edge of his bed with Dalton's words replaying over and over. A truck, voices, a silenced dog, a hole. The official files had scrubbed all of it clean, which meant the truth wasn't lost, it was buried. He pulled out a county map and spread it across the desk. He circled the Halloway farm, then traced a line toward the eastern tree line. If Dalton had been right, that was where the soil held its secrets. The question wasn't whether something had been buried. The question was whether it was still there. Porter knew he couldn't dig alone. He would need records, maybe even ground-penetrating radar, though convincing anyone to authorize that after so many years would be nearly impossible. Unless he found someone who believed as much as he did. He leaned back in the chair, eyes burning with exhaustion. He thought of Elaine's glasses on the counter, the grooves on the floor, the silenced dog. The fields didn't forget. And now, neither would he. That night sleep finally came, but it wasn't restful. He dreamed of headlights cutting through tall corn, of voices shouting in the distance, of earth being shoveled over something heavy. In the dream, he tried to run, but his feet sank into the soil, deeper and deeper, until the earth swallowed him whole. When he woke, his sheets were damp with sweat, and the sound of the wind through the motel vent seemed like a voice whispering his name, Samuel Porter. Listening. Always listening. Porter had spent most of his life avoiding journalists. They were, in his experience, scavengers, eager to sensationalize, reckless with facts, hungry for angles that didn't exist. But as he sat in the diner the next morning, sipping bitter coffee and scanning the paper, one byline caught his eye. Sarah Whitaker. He knew the name. She had produced the recent documentary segment that revived the Halloway case. Young, ambitious, with a reputation for persistence. She wasn't afraid to dig where others backed off. And more importantly, she wasn't bound by old loyalties or the quiet codes that had kept people silent in this county for decades. He found her 2 towns over, setting up lights in a church basement for an interview with a retired deputy. She looked up as Porter entered, suspicion flashing in her eyes before recognition softened it. "You're Porter," she said. "You were quoted in a case file years ago." The rookie who kept asking questions, Porter gave a small nod. "And you're the reporter who won't let this story die." She smirked faintly. "That makes two of us." They sat after the cameras were packed away, the basement quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Porter laid out what Dalton had told him. The truck, the shouting, the sheriff's warning, the filled hole by the tree line. Whitaker's eyes sharpened. She scribbled notes furiously, her pen scratching against the pad. "That never made it into the official record," she said. "Exactly. And you believe him?" "I've been talking to liars my whole life," Porter said. Dalton wasn't lying. He was remembering something he wished he could forget. Whitaker leaned back, tapping the pen against her notebook. "If he's right, then that hole might still be there. Or what was in it," Porter added quietly. Her gaze met his. The silence between them carried the weight of shared obsession. 2 days later, they stood together at the edge of the Halloway property, the fields stretching flat and brittle under a gray sky. Whitaker carried her camera slung over one shoulder, her boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. "This is where Dalton said he saw it?" she asked. "Near the tree line?" "East side." They walked slowly, the sound of their steps swallowed by the land. Birds wheeled overhead, their cries distant. Porter scanned the ground, his eyes trained by years of crime scenes. He looked for depressions, subtle dips in the soil, places where the earth sagged unnaturally. Whitaker filmed everything. The barn leaning against the sky, the empty farmhouse windows, the stubborn weeds pushing through cracked dirt. They reached the trees. The air grew cooler in the shade, the soil darker. Porter crouched, running his hand across the ground. "Here," he murmured. Whitaker pointed the lens downward. The earth was uneven, but not dramatically. Just a subtle swell, as though the land had once been disturbed and then forgotten. "Could be nothing," she whispered. "Or everything," Porter replied. That night, they reviewed the footage in Whitaker's motel room. Grainy images filled the screen. The farmhouse dissolving into shadow, the hollow space beneath the porch, the slight rise in the soil near the tree line. "It's not proof," she said. "No, but it's a start." She hesitated, then leaned forward. "I want to keep digging." "Literally, but I can't do it alone." Porter's throat tightened. At his age, crawling through fields with a shovel felt reckless. Yet the thought of leaving the truth buried gnawed at him. "If we do this," he said, "we do it carefully. At night, quiet. No one can know why. Because the same people who silenced Dalton might still be watching. You don't bury a case this deep without power behind it. Power doesn't just vanish." Whitaker nodded slowly. Her eyes gleamed with something Porter recognized, the same relentless pull that had driven him for years. Obsession. They met again 2 nights later. The moon hung low, a thin sickle above the fields. Whitaker carried a small spade and a flashlight with the beam taped to narrow it. Porter brought gloves and a crowbar, his hands steady despite the tremor of age. They parked a half-mile away and walked the rest, their breaths fogging in the cold night air. The silence was immense, broken only by the rustle of stalks against their legs. At the tree line, Porter knelt and pressed the spade into the soil. It gave easily, too easily for ground untouched in decades. He exchanged a look with Whitaker. She swallowed hard and joined him, scraping quietly, pushing earth aside. The hours stretched, dirt piled beside them. The hole widened, deepened. Sweat dampened Porter's back despite the chill. His knees ached, his breath rasped, but he didn't stop. Then, the sound. A hollow thud. Whitaker froze. Porter brushed away soil with his gloved hands, heart pounding. The shape beneath was rough, curved. Wood. He cleared more until a box-like edge emerged. Old planks, weathered but intact. "A coffin?" Whitaker whispered. Porter shook his head. "Too crude, more like a crate." They dug around it, hands shaking until the lid was exposed. Porter wedged the crowbar beneath the edge and pried. The wood groaned, splitting, the smell of damp earth and rot rushing up to meet them. Inside, something pale gleamed in the flashlight beam. A bone, then another. Whitaker covered her mouth. Porter stared down, the silence roaring in his ears. Not one body, two. They filled the hole back in before dawn, hands blistered, faces streaked with dirt. Whitaker's eyes were wide and haunted, the camera she carried heavy at her side. "We need to call it in," she said. Porter wiped sweat from his brow, his pulse still racing. "Not yet. If we hand this over without leverage, they'll bury it again. You saw what they did to Dalton's statement. What makes you think they won't erase this too?" She hesitated, torn between outrage and fear. "So what do we do?" "We find proof they can't erase. Records, motive, something that ties those bones to the Halloways and forces this county to face it." Whitaker nodded reluctantly. The pact was unspoken, sealed by the dirt still under their nails. The Fields had given up a secret. But secrets alone weren't enough. The truth had to be dragged into daylight, and Porter knew daylight was the most dangerous place of all. The bones changed everything. Porter woke the next morning with dirt still beneath his fingernails, the smell of damp earth clinging to his skin. Whitaker had already left for the city to back up her footage. She insisted on making multiple copies, one for her, one for him, one locked in a safe deposit box. If anything happened to them, the truth wouldn't vanish. But footage of bones in a crude wooden box wasn't enough. Not in a county where a sheriff had once silenced witnesses, erased statements, and let decades of rumor calcify into silence. They needed proof that couldn't be scrubbed from files or dismissed as hysteria. They needed motive. Porter knew where to look. He returned to the courthouse, the basement archives, the humming lights. The clerk gave him a weary look as he requested access to Sheriff Greeley's personal records. "Most of those are sealed," the clerk said. "Sealed doesn't mean burned," Porter replied. The man hesitated, then slid a key across the counter. "Bottom row." "Last cabinet. Don't say I gave it to you." The cabinet was heavy, its drawers reluctant, as though it resisted being opened after so many years. Inside were ledgers, bound in cracking leather, the sheriff's handwriting looping across page after page. Dates, names, citations, arrests. Porter flipped slowly, methodically. At first, it was mundane. Speeding fines, livestock disputes, domestic calls. But then patterns emerged. Repeated visits to the Halloway farm. Notes scribbled in margins. Debts owed, bank unsettled, warned again. Warned again. Porter's pulse quickened. He leaned closer. The dates grew tighter in the weeks before the disappearance. June 23rd, July 3rd, July 11th. Each entry sharper, angrier. Halloway refuses. Situation unresolved. Refuses what? He turned the page. July 12th. Final warning. Must comply. The handwriting was heavier, almost gouged into the paper. Then nothing. No entry for July 14th. No entry after. As though the sheriff's pen had gone still the very night Robert and Elaine vanished. Porter felt a chill crawl along his spine. He copied the entries quickly, sliding the paper into his folder before returning the ledger to its drawer. On the drive back to the motel, his mind spun. What debts had Robert Halloway refused to pay? And why had Greeley taken such personal interest? He spread the notes across the table, the motel room dim except for the glow of a lamp. The timeline sharpened. Repeated visits, escalating warnings. Then disappearance. It wasn't random. It wasn't chance. It was deliberate. Whitaker arrived late that evening, hair disheveled, her eyes sharp with exhaustion. She dropped her camera bag on the bed. "Backups are secure," she said. "But I can't stop thinking about those bones. If we sit on them too long—" "We won't," Porter interrupted. He slid the copied ledger entries toward her. She scanned them, her expression shifting from confusion to horror. He threatened them. "Over and over, right up until they vanished. This is motive." "It's a piece," Porter said. "But we need the rest." "Which is?" "Money, land, something worth silencing them." For Whitaker tapped the page with her pen. "The debts. Maybe Robert owed the wrong people. Maybe Greeley wasn't just a sheriff. Maybe he was a collector." The idea landed with the weight of truth. In small towns, authority often blurred into power, and power into profit. Porter rubbed his temples. "If that's the case, the answers won't be in the courthouse. They'll be in the bank." The next morning, they visited First County Savings, the only bank in town that had survived since the 60s. Its lobby smelled of polish and paper, the old vault looming like a relic. The manager, a man in his 40s with slicked hair and polite suspicion in his eyes, listened as Porter introduced himself. "We're looking for records on the Halloways," Porter said. "Accounts, loans, anything from 1960 to 1964. The manager hesitated. "Those records are archived. It could take weeks to—" Whitaker leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "We already know Sheriff Greeley was involved. We've seen his ledger. If we walk out of here with nothing, this bank's name will be in the first chapter of what we publish." The man paled. He excused himself and returned 15 minutes later with a thin folder. "Don't say where you got this," he muttered. Inside were loan documents. Robert Halloway had taken out a sizable loan in 1961, secured against the farm. Payments were steady at first, then irregular. By 1963, he was months behind. Notices of default stacked in the file. The last letter, dated July 10th, 1964, bore the sheriff's signature. "Final notice. Property subject to seizure." Whitaker's hand trembled as she turned the page. "So it was about land." Porter nodded slowly. "And Greeley wasn't just warning him. He was enforcing for the bank. But why make them disappear? Why not just foreclose?" Porter closed the folder. "Because Robert refused. And maybe refusal wasn't tolerated." That night, they returned to the farm. The wind swept across the fields, bending the dry stalks. Porter stood at the tree line, staring toward the filled hole they had disturbed. "It wasn't just murder," he said quietly. "It was erasure. Take the land, silence the debt, bury the evidence, make it all vanish." Whitaker adjusted her camera, filming his silhouette against the dark fields. And it worked. For almost 40 years, Porter's chest tightened. He thought of the breakfast table, the half-eaten eggs, the dog chained outside. Ordinary lives swallowed whole by power and silence. But silence had limits. And now, the fields were speaking. The bank file sat heavy between Porter and Whitaker on the motel table. Its pages smelled faintly of mildew and ink, the past pressed into every crease. Outside, rain began to tap against the window, steady and rhythmic, as though marking time. Whitaker rubbed her eyes, her notepad full of arrows and underlined words. So Greeley was threatening foreclosure, enforcing debts. But the question is, who was really pulling the strings? Porter leaned back in his chair. His shoulders ached from years of wear, but his mind stayed sharp. Sheriffs don't move money on their own. Somebody wanted that land. Somebody with enough influence to keep the sheriff's silence ironclad. Whitaker flipped through the file again. There has to be a name, a beneficiary, someone who profited when the Halloways vanished. Porter's gaze landed on a page tucked into the back of the folder, a typed memo, faint but legible. Transfer of collateral in case of default. Halloway acreage to be reassigned under holding account. Signatory, Richard Kane. The name stirred something faint in Porter's memory. He had seen it before, long ago, in whispers across old reports. "Richard Kane," he murmured. Whitaker looked up. "Who is he?" Porter didn't answer right away. He pulled a county map from his bag, unfolded it, and traced the eastern border with his finger. Kane owned most of this stretch by the 70s. Built Kane Agricorp. Grain silos, processing plants, half the county's jobs. If you wanted work, you worked for Kane. If you wanted out, you still owed him. He was everywhere, and he started with the Halloway farm, Whitaker said, her voice low. "Looks that way." The rain thickened outside, drumming harder against the glass. Porter felt the rhythm deep in his chest. Whitaker scribbled the name across her notepad in heavy strokes. "So Kane gets the land. Greeley makes sure the Halloways disappear, and the county closes its eyes." Porter stared at the map, his thoughts pulling threads together. If Kane was behind it, there'll be more than one farm. More families who lost everything. We just need to find the pattern. The next day, they drove east to the county recorder's office. The clerk, a tired woman with half-moon glasses, looked annoyed as Porter asked for property transfers from the early 60s. "That's a lot of files," she said. "We'll narrow it," Whitaker replied quickly. "Just farms seized for default between 62 and 66. The woman sighed but returned with 2 heavy ledgers. Porter and Whitaker pored over them at a side table, their pens scratching furiously. Names repeated. Families who had farmed for generations, their land signed over in abrupt transfers. Thompsons, Mullers, Parkers, and again, Kane Holding Company. Whitaker's face tightened as the list grew. It wasn't just the Halloways. This was systematic. Porter nodded grimly. They weren't the only ones erased. Just the only ones who wouldn't go quietly. He tapped the page where Robert Halloway's name ended in a thick line of ink. And for that, they paid the highest price. That evening, they spread their notes across the motel bed. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with damp earth. Porter circled names on the list. "We need someone who remembers. A survivor. A family member who saw their farm taken." Whitaker chewed her pen. What if no one talks? What if the fear's still here? Then we find someone with less to lose. Whitaker's eyes lit. Like a worker. Someone who saw Kane's men up close, Porter nodded. Field hands. Truck drivers. People who hauled for him. They'd know if something went wrong out at that farm. Whitaker flipped open her laptop, fingers flying across the keys. She pulled up obituary records, old union rosters, scattered references from digitized newspapers. One name appeared more than once. Earl McCready. Truck driver. Employed by Kane's company from 1962 until his sudden retirement in 1965. Porter narrowed his eyes. Right after the Halloways vanished. Whitaker checked the address. Still in town. A retirement home on the north side. Porter felt the old pull in his chest. Another voice. Another piece of the buried puzzle. The retirement home smelled of antiseptic and weak coffee. Porter and Whitaker signed the visitor log and followed a nurse down the hall to a room at the end. Earl McCready was 81, his body frail, his skin like parchment. But his eyes flicked to them with surprising sharpness. "You're not family," he rasped. "No," Porter said. "We're here about Kane Agricorp, about the farm you drove to in July 1964. McCready's expression froze. His hand tightened on the blanket. "I don't know what you're talking about." Whitaker leaned forward. "Mr. McCready, we're not here to cause trouble. We just want the truth. People deserve to know what happened." McCready's jaw worked. Silence stretched, heavy and brittle. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "They told us not to talk," he whispered. "Said it was just business." "What business?" Porter pressed. McCready's eyes glistened. "We went out there late." Sheriff was already waiting. He waved us through. We loaded something into the truck, heavy, covered with tarps. We didn't ask questions, Whitaker's breath caught. The Halloways? McCrady's lips trembled. I didn't see faces. I didn't want to, but I heard the dog. It barked once, then there was a shot. After that, silence. The room felt colder. Porter gripped the arm of his chair, his stomach tight. Where did you take the load? He asked. McCrady's gaze drifted toward the window. East Fields. Kane's men were waiting. We dug all night. Sheriff stood there smoking like it was nothing. Then we covered it up. Drove home at dawn. Porter felt the words carve into him. The confirmation. The conspiracy. Why didn't you tell anyone? Whitaker whispered. McCrady's voice cracked. Because I wanted to live. Tears slid down his cheeks. You don't cross men like Kane. You don't cross the sheriff. You shut your mouth and keep driving. They left the retirement home in silence, the dusk pressing in heavy around them. Whitaker gripped her camera tight, her knuckles white. He admitted it, she said, her voice shaking. He admitted they buried them. Porter stared at the darkening horizon. And he admitted who stood over the hole. Kane. And Greeley. The names rang like a sentence. The Fields had given up more than bones now. They had given up witnesses. And with every word, the silence that had shielded the guilty for decades was cracking open. The motel parking lot was nearly empty when Porter returned from the retirement home. A single truck sat at the far end. Headlights off, engine idling. He noticed it the moment he turned in. The way the exhaust curled faintly in the cool night air. The way the driver's silhouette sat motionless behind the wheel. Whitaker noticed too. That's not coincidence. Porter parked close to their room, his pulse steady though his thoughts raced. He didn't look toward the truck again, but he felt its gaze, heavy and unblinking. Inside, Whitaker closed the curtains quickly, her breath uneven. They know we're digging. They've known since the night we opened that ground, Porter said. Now they're letting us know. Whitaker set her camera bag down, hands trembling. So what do we do? Porter checked the lock, the chain, the bolts. We keep moving. Fear's what kept this case buried. If we stop now, they win again. But even as he said it, he felt the weight of the truck's engine humming outside, a low growl that seeped into the walls. By morning, the truck was gone. But the message remained. Porter scanned the lot carefully before they left, every shadow a potential watcher. Their next stop was the county library. Whitaker insisted on cross-checking Kane's acquisitions with local newspapers, searching for patterns in how farms disappeared. Porter kept watch while she scrolled through microfilm reels, the flickering headlines casting shadows across her face. One article stood out. Local sheriff facilitates smooth transfer of family properties to Kane Holdings. The date was July 18, 1964, 4 days after the Halloways vanished. Whitaker slammed her pen against the page. He didn't just look away. He signed off. Porter studied the photograph printed beside the article. Sheriff Greeley and Richard Kane, shaking hands in front of the bank, both smiling, both looking directly at the camera. Two men immortalized in ink, the silence behind them invisible. That afternoon, they interviewed one of the names from their property transfer list, Margaret Parker, whose family lost their farm in 1963. She lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, her garden overgrown, her eyes sharp despite her age. Kane took everything, she said bitterly. My father said we were behind on payments, but I never saw the money change hands. Sheriff came out, said it was legal, said it was final. We left the next day with nothing but clothes. Did anyone fight back? Whitaker asked. Some tried. But if you pushed, you'd find your tires slashed, your barn burned. People learned quick. You didn't stand in Kane's way. Not if you wanted to wake up the next morning. Her words hung heavy in the room. Porter felt the old anger burn in his chest again. Fear wasn't just a byproduct of power. It was its currency. As they left, Whitaker whispered, "It's all the same story. Debt, foreclosure, silence. But only the Halloways vanished completely because Robert refused," Porter said. And Kane needed an example. The thought chilled him. An example wasn't just erased. It was displayed. Not for the public, but for those who might think of resisting. That night, back at the motel, Porter found the door slightly ajar. His gut tightened instantly. "Stay behind me," he told Whitaker. He pushed the door open slowly, every sense alert. The room smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. Papers from their investigation were scattered across the bed. Drawers pulled open, camera bag unzipped. Nothing was stolen, but everything had been touched. A warning. On the nightstand, someone had left a single object, a spent shotgun shell, polished clean. Whitaker's face drained of color. "Jesus!" Porter picked it up, rolling it between his fingers. His heart pounded, but his voice stayed calm. "They don't want us dead yet. They just want us scared." "Well, it's working," she whispered. Porter slipped the shell into his pocket. "Then we make it work for us. Fear means they know we're close." He sat at the table, gathering the scattered notes. His hands shook only slightly as he stacked them. Whitaker began filming, documenting the intrusion, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "This is proof," she said. "They're still out there. Whoever Kane's men were, whoever Greeley protected, they're still watching." Porter nodded, "Which means the Halloways still matter. After 40 years, they still matter." Sleep was impossible. Porter lay on the bed fully dressed, listening for footsteps outside, for the growl of another truck. His mind replayed Dalton's voice, McCready's tears, Margaret Parker's bitterness. Threads weaving tighter, forming a net that pointed in one direction. Kane. But Kane was dead. A stroke in 1987 had ended his empire, his land divided among heirs and corporations. Yet his shadow stretched forward, carried by men who had stood beside him, men who had learned from him. And shadows, Porter knew, didn't die easily. By dawn, Porter made his decision. "We can't stay in this motel." Too exposed, too easy to find. Whitaker looked up from her laptop, dark circles under her eyes. "Where do we go?" He thought of the Halloway farmhouse, the silence inside, the grooves on the floor, the fields stretching endless. It was dangerous, but it was also hidden. "The farm," he said. "If we're going to finish this, we finish it where it started." Whitaker hesitated. Then she nodded. "Then we finish it." They packed their notes, their footage, their fear. Outside, the morning sun burned away the damp, casting long shadows across the lot. The truck from the night before was gone. But Porter knew they hadn't been abandoned. They had been marked, and the fields were waiting. They arrived at the Halloway farm just before dusk. The sun slid low, staining the sky in bruised purples and reds. The farmhouse loomed against it, sagging but unbroken, its windows black as empty eyes. The barn leaned farther now, ribs showing through rust and rot. Porter killed the engine and let the silence swell. Whitaker gripped her camera, recording from the passenger seat. "This is where they lived," she whispered, "and where they died." "Maybe," Porter said, "but the house doesn't lie. Not if you listen right." They unloaded their things, flashlights, notebooks, bottled water, a thermos of coffee, and carried them inside. Dust stirred around their boots. The smell of mildew and old wood thickened in the air. Whitaker set up her tripod in the kitchen, her camera lens sweeping across the room. "This is where the story froze," she said softly. "Plates still on the table, glasses by the sink." The moment before they vanished, Porter touched the grooves near the back door again, the shallow scars cut into the boards. He knelt, running his palm along them, as though pressing his skin into the memory. "They were dragged," he murmured. Out that door. Into the fields, Whitaker zoomed in with her camera. Why didn't the sheriff put this in his report? Because he knew exactly what they were. As night fell, they lit 2 lanterns in the living room. The shadows lengthened, the old furniture casting warped shapes against the walls. The air felt heavy, as if the house itself leaned in to listen. Whitaker set up her laptop on the floor, uploading the day's footage. Porter wandered room to room, his flashlight beam cutting across peeling wallpaper, collapsed ceilings, the remnants of lives abandoned. In the bedroom, he paused. The Bible still sat on the nightstand, its leather warped, its pages crumbling. He flipped it open gently, the spine groaning. Words underlined in faded ink caught his eye. "The truth shall set you free." He closed the book with a shiver. Near midnight, Whitaker joined him in the bedroom doorway, her face pale in the lantern light. "I keep hearing things on playback," she said. "What things?" "Voices. Or maybe it's just wind. But listen." She played the recording. The camera's microphone had captured their digging 2 nights earlier, the scrape of shovels, their whispered breaths. But beneath it, faint, almost indistinguishable, a sound like a low moan. Porter frowned, listening twice, 3 times. The sound was there, too steady to be wind, too human to ignore. He shut the laptop. "We're tired. We'll listen again tomorrow." But long after Whitaker fell asleep on her sleeping bag, Porter sat in the dark, the sound replaying in his head. A voice caught between earth and silence. The next morning they explored the attic. Dust coated everything like a burial shroud. Boxes slumped against the beams, their cardboard soft with age. Whitaker pried one open. Inside were letters. Elaine's handwriting neat, Robert's rougher. Porter sorted through them, the paper fragile under his hands. Most were ordinary. Bills, notes to neighbors, orders for farm equipment. But one envelope was thicker, sealed with wax, never sent. Elaine's handwriting on the front read, "To be opened in emergency." Whitaker gasped softly. "Should we?" Porter tore the seal. The letter inside was short, scrawled in a hurried hand. "Robert says they're coming for the farm. He says we'll never leave alive if we don't give it over. I don't trust the sheriff. If anyone finds this, know that we didn't go willingly. Elaine Halloway." Whitaker's hand flew to her mouth. She knew. She knew they were coming. Porter stared at the ink, faded but undeniable. His throat tightened. For decades, people had wondered if the Halloways ran away, if they abandoned their lives. But here, in Elaine's own hand, was the truth. They hadn't left. They had been taken. They brought the letter down to the kitchen table, laying it flat beside their notes. Whitaker filmed it carefully, the camera capturing every line. "This changes everything," she said. "This is their voice. Elaine's voice." Porter nodded slowly. "It's not just a mystery anymore. It's testimony." But even as he said it, he felt the weight of danger pressing closer. If Kane's shadow still stretched across the county, this letter was dynamite. Proof of murder, proof of conspiracy, and proof worth killing for. That evening, Whitaker suggested staying one more night at the farmhouse. "The footage here, it feels different, raw." "The house tells the story better than we ever could," Porter agreed reluctantly. They set their lanterns in the living room again, the house creaking around them like an old body settling into sleep. Around midnight, Porter heard it. A car engine, distant but growing closer. He moved to the window, peering out into the dark fields. Headlights swept slowly down the dirt road, pausing near the edge of the property. The engine idled, low and steady, just as Dalton had described 40 years ago. Whitaker woke, rubbing her eyes. "What is it?" Porter's voice was a whisper. "History. Coming back." They crouched low, watching through the crack in the curtains. The car sat there for minutes, Engine humming, headlights throwing pale beams across the dead grass. Then, slowly, it reversed, turned, and disappeared into the night. Silence returned, thick and heavy. Whitaker's hands shook. "They know we're here." Porter slid the shotgun shell from his pocket, the one left in their motel room, and placed it on the windowsill. "Then let them know we're not leaving." The fields around them stretched endless and dark, waiting, remembering. And the house seemed to breathe. The farmhouse felt colder in the morning, as if the night had left something behind. Whitaker brewed coffee on a small camp stove, her hands still shaking when she poured. Porter watched the steam curl upward, disappearing into the gray light filtering through broken windows. "They were watching us," she said finally. "Sitting out there, like they wanted us to know." Porter nodded. "That's the point. Fear is their first weapon, and their second." He glanced toward the fields. Silence. They drank in uneasy quiet, both knowing that staying here made them vulnerable but also necessary. Every answer they had found so far, the grooves in the floor, Dalton's memory, McCrady's confession, Elaine's letter, had come from returning to the places others had abandoned. The farmhouse wasn't just a ruin. It was a witness, and it wasn't done speaking. Later that day, Porter drove them into town. He wanted one last set of files. Sheriff Greeley's personal papers, rumored to have been stored in the attic of his daughter's house after his death. Her name was Margaret Greeley Hayes, and she lived on the edge of town in a 2-story brick house that looked too neat, too polished, like a place scrubbed clean of history. She met them at the door, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and carefully styled hair. "My father's been gone 20 years, she said, her voice clipped. "What could you possibly want with him now?" "We're investigating the Halloway disappearance," Whitaker said carefully. Something flickered across Margaret's face. Fear or anger, or maybe both. "That case is closed." Porter stepped forward. "Closed doesn't mean solved. We believe your father's notes may help." Margaret hesitated. Her grip tightened on the door frame. Then, finally, she sighed. "Come in. But you won't like what you find." The attic was hot, the air thick with dust. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, each marked with dates. Margaret pulled one toward them and stepped back. "My father kept everything," she said. "Too much, if you ask me." Porter lifted the lid. Inside were ledgers, receipts, and letters bound with twine. He sorted through them carefully, his pulse quickening when he found a folder marked Kane Holdings. Inside, receipts of payments, signed and initialed by Sheriff Greeley. Cash transfers, land acquisitions, security services rendered, bribes. Whitaker leaned over his shoulder, her camera rolling. He was on Kane's payroll. Porter flipped to the last page, dated July 15, 1964, the day after the Halloways vanished. The entry read simply, "Debt resolved, property secured, silence insured." Margaret's voice shook from the shadows. "I told you." "You wouldn't like it," Porter turned to her. "You knew?" "I knew he wasn't a good man, but he was my father." "You spend a lifetime learning not to see." Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with the weight of decades unspoken. "Take what you want," she whispered. "Maybe it's time the truth left this house." Back at the farmhouse, Whitaker spread the documents across the kitchen table. Pages rustled under her hands as she filmed each one. "This is it," she said. "Proof, motive, corruption tied in ink." Porter sat heavily in a chair, staring at the words. Debt resolved. Silence insured. The sheriff hadn't just looked away. He had orchestrated it. He closed his eyes, feeling the house breathe around him. Elaine's letter, the grooves in the floor, McCrady's trembling confession, Greeley's ledger. All of it converged, pointing to the same truth. The Halloways hadn't vanished. They had been silenced. That night, the intimidation returned. Whitaker was reviewing footage when Porter heard tires crunching over gravel. He moved to the window, heart hammering. Headlights again, closer this time. A truck idled at the edge of the yard. Whitaker grabbed her camera, filming through the cracked curtain. "We need this on record," she whispered. The truck's door opened. A figure stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden by shadow. He walked slowly toward the porch, boots crunching, then stopped 10 feet away. He said nothing, did nothing, just stood there. Porter stepped into the doorway, lantern in his hand, every muscle taut. "What do you want?" he called. The man didn't answer. Minutes stretched, the silence unbearable. Finally, he turned, walked back to the truck, and drove off without a word. Whitaker's camera shook in her hands. "They're testing us." Seeing if we'll break, Porter's jaw tightened. "Then we don't break." But as he lay awake later, shotgun shells still on the windowsill, he knew the message had changed. This wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about time. Time running out. The farmhouse creaked under the night wind. Porter sat at the kitchen table, his revolver within reach. Whitaker curled in her sleeping bag with her camera still on the tripod, red light glowing faintly. Sleep refused him. His ears strained for every sound. The groan of wood, the whisper of grass outside, the hum of a distant engine that might or might not be real. By dawn, his eyes burned. The fields outside shimmered with dew, beautiful in their silence, but Porter couldn't shake the weight in his chest. The last visitor hadn't come to frighten them. He had come to measure them, and Porter knew what came after measurement. They spent the morning combing the barn. Whitaker filmed the rotting beams, the rusted tools, the rope still hanging from its hook. Dust fell in sheets as Porter pried open a locked cabinet with his crowbar. Inside lay farming ledgers, spare parts, and something else. A bundle of canvas sacks, stiff with age. He unwrapped one slowly. Inside was a stained shirt, Robert Halloway's initials stitched at the collar. The fabric was stiff, discolored with dark blotches that hadn't faded with time. Whitaker gasped. "Is that—" "Blood," Porter said, his voice low. She lifted the camera, hands shaking. "We have to get this tested." Porter folded the shirt carefully back into the sack. "We will, but not yet. First, we prove it never should have been here. Because if the sheriff had searched honestly in 1964, this shirt would have been evidence. Instead, it had sat sealed away in the barn, hidden, forgotten, waiting. The house remembered. The barn remembered. And now both were speaking. That afternoon, Porter suggested they check the well. It sat behind the house, capped with rotted boards, weeds curling up around its base. The rope was gone, the bucket rusted to dust. He pried the boards loose. A smell rose from the darkness, damp and metallic. Whitaker aimed her flashlight down. The beam caught glimmers of water far below, and something floating just above it. A boot. Old leather, cracked, bloated by decades of damp. Whitaker's breath caught. "Oh my God!" They lowered the flashlight farther. The water rippled, shifting. For a moment, Porter thought he saw a pale shape just beneath the surface, long and thin, like a bone. He pulled the light back quickly, his heart pounding. "We document. We don't touch. Not yet." Whitaker nodded, swallowing hard, filming steadily. The silence around the well felt different, charged, almost humming. Porter closed the boards again, pressing his palms flat against the splintered wood. The well remembered too. By evening, the storm rolled in. Rain pounded the roof, thunder rumbling across the fields. Whitaker filmed the storm from the porch, lightning illuminating the acres in white flashes. Porter sat inside, staring at the bloodied shirt folded neatly on the table. The evidence was piling. Bones in a box, Elaine's letter, Greeley's ledger, Robert's bloodied shirt, a boot in the well. Each piece alone could be dismissed, buried, explained away. Together they formed a body screaming from the grave. And Kane's men, whoever remained of them, knew it. The attack came just after midnight. Porter had drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep when the sound of shattering glass jolted him awake. He rolled instinctively, grabbing the revolver as Whitaker cried out. A brick lay on the floor, shards glittering around it. Rain slanted in through the broken window. Headlights swept across the front yard. Tires crunched over gravel. "They're here," Porter hissed. Whitaker scrambled for the camera, heart hammering. "We have to get this on film." Another crash. This time, the back window. Porter moved quickly, crouching low, revolver raised. Shadows flickered outside, 3 figures circling the house. A voice shouted through the storm, "Walk away! Leave it buried, or we'll bury you with it." Whitaker's breath came in gasps. "They're threatening us on tape. Keep them talking." Porter's voice was steady, louder than the thunder. "You can't scare us. The truth's already out." For a moment, silence, then laughter, low, cruel, carried by the storm. A shot cracked. Wood splintered inches from Porter's head. Whitaker screamed. "Get down!" Porter barked, dragging her to the floor. The camera clattered, still rolling, capturing the chaos. Outside, footsteps retreated. Engines roared. The truck tore away down the drive. Taillights swallowed by the rain. The house fell silent again, broken only by Whitaker's ragged breaths and Porter's pounding heart. When dawn broke, they walked the yard in grim silence. The grass was torn with boot prints. The brick still lay on the kitchen floor, dark with rain. Whitaker's voice trembled. "They're not just watching anymore. They're trying to end it." Porter slipped the spent bullet casing from the broken window frame into his pocket. "That means we're close. But how much closer can we get before they kill us?" Porter looked out across the drenched fields, the stalks bending under the wind. "Close enough to make sure the Halloways are never silenced again." The farmhouse was different after the attack. Every groan of the wood, every sigh of the wind through broken windows, felt sharper, more dangerous. Whitaker kept her camera close, filming obsessively, as if the act of recording could protect them. Porter moved slower, conserving energy, knowing each step mattered more now. They were too close to stop. The morning after, Porter returned to the attic. He had a nagging thought, a thread that refused to let go. Elaine's emergency letter, hidden for decades, suggested more than fear. It suggested preparation. He searched the rafters, hands brushing dust and cobwebs. His fingers snagged on something wedged between beams, a tin box, rusted but intact. He carried it downstairs, setting it gently on the table. Whitaker filmed as he pried it open. Inside lay photographs, carefully wrapped in wax paper. Robert and Elaine, standing with neighbors, their smiles small but genuine. The farmhouse in summer, bright with corn rising tall. And then, one that froze Porter's breath. A black sedan parked beside the barn. Sheriff Greeley in uniform. A man beside him in a suit, taller, heavier, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the lens. Richard Kane. Whitaker's whisper broke the silence. "Proof they were together here." Porter flipped the photo over. Elaine's handwriting scrawled on the back. "If anything happens to us, show this." His hands shook as he set the photo down. Decades of silence cracked further. The Halloways hadn't just been victims. They had documented their own danger. That afternoon, they visited Margaret Parker again. Porter showed her the photo, Elaine's handwriting trembling against the yellowed paper. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "We all suspected, but no one dared keep records. Your life wasn't worth the truth, and now we have their truth," Porter said. Margaret hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There's someone else you should talk to. He worked the fields for Kane back then. He saw things. I never said his name before, because he asked me not to. But if anyone deserves to know the truth, it's you." She scribbled a name and address on a slip of paper. Jonah Reeves. Porter folded it carefully. Another thread. Another voice. Reeves lived on the outskirts of town in a small house lined with wind chimes. He was nearly 90, his back bent, his eyes pale but steady. He listened as Porter introduced himself, his silence heavy. Then, finally, Reeves spoke. "I was there the night the Halloways disappeared." Whitaker gasped. "You saw it?" Reeves nodded slowly. His voice was a whisper, but each word carried weight. "I was working for Kane. We hauled grain by day, did other jobs by night. That night, Kane himself came out, Sheriff Greeley with him. They told us to bring the truck to the Halloway farm, said we were collecting collateral." His hands trembled as he clasped them together. "But it wasn't crops we hauled. It was them." Robert fought. Elaine screamed. They dragged them through the kitchen, out the back. We loaded them like sacks. I'll never forget the sound, the dog barking, then the shot. The silence after Whitaker's camera shook in her hands. Porter sat very still, the old rage burning cold in his chest. "Why didn't you speak sooner?" he asked. Reeves's eyes filled. "Because men who did disappear too. Kane owned the land, the law, the silence. I was a coward, but I've carried their voices in my head every night since. I still hear them." He looked at Porter, pleading. "Tell their story. Please, don't let them vanish again." They left Reeves's house in silence, the weight of his confession pressing on them. Back at the farmhouse, Porter laid the pieces out across the table. Elaine's letter, Robert's bloodied shirt, the boot in the well, Greeley's ledger, the photo of Kane and Greeley, Reeves's testimony. The story was whole now. Sheriff Greeley enforcing Kane's debts, Kane hungry for land and power, the Halloways refusing to yield, the fields swallowing the evidence, and silence stretching decades. Whitaker lowered her camera. "We have everything. This could bring the county to its knees." Porter nodded, but his chest felt tight. "Then they'll come for us again. Harder this time. They won't let this see daylight." Whitaker's voice trembled. "So what do we do?" He looked out the window at the field swaying under twilight, endless and watchful. "We tell it anyway." That night, Porter couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, revolver in his lap, the shotgun shell still on the sill. He thought of Reeves's trembling voice, of Elaine's letter, of Dalton's haunted eyes. The Halloways had been silenced once, but now the field spoke through every witness, every artifact, every scar in the wood. And Porter knew he was carrying their voices forward, even if it cost him everything. The storm returned on their last night in the farmhouse. Rain lashed the windows. Thunder rattled the beams, and the wind moaned through broken walls. Whitaker's camera captured everything. The flickering lantern light, the papers spread across the kitchen table like offerings, the fatigue carved into Porter's face. They had the story. The question was whether they would live to tell it. Whitaker sat cross-legged on the floor, headphones in, reviewing footage again. The audio from Reeves's confession hissed faintly, his voice fragile but steady. "We loaded them like sacks. I'll never forget the silence after." She pulled off the headphones, her eyes wet. "If anything happens to us, this footage has to make it out. Promise me, Porter." He met her gaze. It will. But promises meant little in the dark. Near midnight, Porter heard it. Tires on gravel, the growl of engines. Not one this time, but two. Headlights cut across the fields, slicing through the rain. Whitaker grabbed her camera, trembling. "They're back." Porter checked his revolver, his pulse steady. He motioned her behind the table. "Keep filming." No matter what, the truck stopped at the edge of the yard. Doors slammed. Shadows moved through the rain. 3, 4 men, heavy with purpose. A voice shouted, muffled by the storm. "It ends tonight. Burn it down if you have to." Porter felt the words like a blade. They weren't here to scare anymore. They were here to erase. He raised his revolver, aimed at the window, and fired once. The crack echoed through the house. The shadows froze, then scattered. Shouts rose. A bottle shattered against the porch, flames licking in the rain. "They're trying to torch it," Whitaker cried. Porter grabbed the lantern, dousing its flame. Smoke curled through the room. "Upstairs, now!" They scrambled to the second floor, boots pounding on rotting boards. Whitaker clutched her camera, breath ragged. Through the broken window they saw men circling, fire sputtering against the wet ground, their flashlights darting like hunting beams. "Hand over what you found," one shouted, "or we bury you with them." Porter's voice was iron. "The truth's already out." Another shot cracked, splintering wood near his head. Whitaker screamed but kept filming, lens fixed on the chaos below. Then, sirens, faint at first, then growing louder, cutting through the storm. The men froze, headlights flashing across their faces. One cursed, another shouted to run. The trucks roared to life, spinning mud as they tore away into the night. Porter lowered his revolver slowly, chest heaving. Whitaker's camera caught his face, lined with sweat and fury. "They'll be back," she whispered. Porter shook his head. "No, now they'll scatter. The sirens spooked them." Whitaker frowned. "But who called them?" The sheriff's cruisers arrived minutes later, lights washing the farmhouse red and blue. Younger deputies stepped out cautiously, hands on holsters, eyes wide at the sight of Porter and Whitaker framed in the broken window. The lead deputy, barely 30, shouted up through the rain, "Mr. Porter! Miss Whitaker! You're safe now, safe!" The word rang hollow. They came down slowly, Whitaker's camera still rolling. The deputies examined the yard, burned glass, footprints in mud, shell casings glinting under headlights. One knelt by the porch, holding up the scorched bottle. "This wasn't just trespassing," he muttered. Porter handed over the bloodied shirt, Elaine's letter, the photograph of Kane and Greeley. This is what they were trying to destroy. The deputy studied the evidence, his face pale. "Jesus." Whitaker's voice was steady despite her shaking hands. "It's over. The silence ends tonight." But Porter knew better. Silence never ended all at once. It cracked slowly, like ice on a river, until the flood broke through. The Halloways were gone. But their voices had survived, in Dalton's memory, in McCready's tears, in Reeves's confession, in Elaine's hurried letter, in every scar the land had carried. The fields had spoken, and now the county would have to listen. The deputies escorted them back to town before dawn. Whitaker sat in the back seat, clutching her camera, her eyes fixed on the endless rows of fields sliding past. Porter stared out the window too, exhausted but unbroken. For the first time, the land didn't look empty. It looked alive, breathing, whispering through the stalks. He thought of Elaine's underlined Bible verse, "The truth shall set you free." Maybe, at last, freedom was coming. The farmhouse stood silent again when dawn broke over the county. Rain had washed the night clean, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Broken glass glistened in the yard, scorch marks blackened the porch, and the grooves in the kitchen floor remained, cutting their way through time. By noon, news trucks lined the road. Reporters stood in mud with microphones, speaking over the drone of generators. Deputies moved in and out of the house, evidence bags in hand. The old story, once dismissed, once buried, was everywhere. The Halloway disappearance was no longer a whisper in dark bars or a story told by grandmothers to frighten children. It was fact. Whitaker's footage aired within 48 hours. National networks picked it up within a week. Elaine's letter filled television screens, her handwriting trembling across the decades. "We didn't go willingly." Reeves's confession played in shaky audio, his voice cracking with memory. McCrady's tears ran raw in the glow of living rooms across the country. The story spread like fire through dry stalks. Porter watched it all from the quiet of his apartment back in the city. His revolver rested in a drawer, untouched. His badge, tarnished and worn, lay beside it. He no longer needed it. His work was done. But silence, he knew, was never finished. In the months that followed, lawsuits surfaced. Kane's heirs denied involvement, insisting they knew nothing of their patriarch's crimes. The sheriff's name was stripped from the courthouse, his portrait taken down from the county hall. Former deputies were interviewed, some breaking at last, admitting what they had seen but never dared say. The farm itself was declared a crime scene. Excavations began at the well, at the tree line where Dalton had once seen fresh earth. More bones surfaced. Animals, yes, but also fragments that could only be human. Forensic teams sifted soil that had lain untouched for decades, each spadeful another wound opening. The land gave back what it had swallowed. Whitaker's documentary won awards. She stood under bright lights, microphones flashing, her voice steady as she dedicated it to Robert and Elaine Halloway, and to every family erased by silence. But when the cameras shut off, she still woke some nights in a cold sweat, hearing the echo of voices in the fields, the low moan her microphone had caught that night of digging. She called Porter sometimes, her voice small in the dark. "Do you think they rest now?" Porter never lied. "I don't know, but I think they're heard." For Porter, the case never left him. Retirement felt heavier now, quieter, like he'd been hollowed out by the truth he carried. He visited the farm one last time in late autumn. The fields brittle, the stalks rattling in the wind like dry bones. The farmhouse was cordoned off, its windows boarded, its roof sagging further. The barn had collapsed under the weight of storms. Yet the land still breathed, still whispered. He stood at the tree line, the place where Dalton had seen the hole, where he and Whitaker had unearthed the crude wooden box. The ground had been dug again by investigators, turned over, laid bare. But Porter felt no peace, only the echo of what had been stolen. He closed his eyes, heard the barking of the dog, the shouts, the engine, the silence after. The fields no longer looked empty. They looked haunted by memory, heavy with voices that would never stop speaking. He whispered into the wind, unsure if it was prayer or apology, "I'm listening." And for a moment, he thought the wind whispered back. Years later, children no longer dared each other to sneak into the Halloway farm. They came instead on school trips, guided by history teachers who spoke of corruption, power, and silence. A plaque was mounted at the edge of the property, in memory of Robert and Elaine Halloway, and all who were lost to silence. May the truth be louder than fear. The fields swayed behind it, endless and golden in the sun. No longer empty, never empty again.